Greetings, fellow humans. It is spooky time, which means I have spooky projects in store. Now, I cannot deny that as a child growing up in the 90s in North America, Hocus Pocus was one of my favourite Halloween films. Still is one of my favourite Halloween films. So I thought it would be fun, in light of Hocus Pocus 2 coming out, to do a Hocus Pocus themed project. And after diving through my stash and doing various bits of considering, I made some decisions. One of which is that I'm not going to do a screen-accurate cosplay of any of the characters because that's not really my jam, and the other was that I wanted to give it a vintage twist. So, in my stash, I have this green velvet. This just seemed like too good an opportunity to use it to pass up, and it just screamed Winifred Sanderson at me. So, vintage, velvet, Winifred Sanderson. I had a second fabric in my stash that I thought might come in handy, which was this black velvet. Now I know that Winifred Sanderson has green velvet and purple velvet, but I don't have any purple velvet, so black velvet it shall be. I was then thinking about what kind of vintage look I'd like to make, but then, when rifling through my patterns, I came across this bad boy, and I just thought having the green on the outside and the central panel in black would be absolutely perfect. So I'm gonna do it. So we have a starting point. 50s, Winifred Sanderson. However, she has a central piece in purple and then obviously the huge green robe that goes over it all the way to the floor, which doesn't really match up with this. So I went digging through some of the original vintage patterns that I have that I recently purchased in a job lot off eBay, which there is a video about if you're curious. This economy design number E65 is an original 50s pattern, and I really want to use the bolero out of this and make it in the green velvet as well to create that kind of narrow section down the middle, just to make it more Winifred-y. More recognisable. But I'm excited. I think a 50s Winifred Sanderson is going to be a lot of fun to put together, and I am raring to go. So I rolled out my fabric and started looking over my pattern pieces, but then, well... So cutting out might have to wait, at least until I've explained some things to you. I've made some discoveries. One of those discoveries is that my green velvet isn't actually wide enough in any direction, in any orientation, to put the skirt piece for this pattern on. It's meant to be a full circle skirt, the pattern piece is a half circle skirt and is too wide. So if I'm going to use this fabric, I may need to bind the bottom edge of the skirt instead of it having a hem, because that means I could take 3 centimeters or so off the bottom of the skirt the whole way round. Or maybe I could just take off a smaller amount than that and have a narrower hem. A few other things I didn't realise. When I opened up this pattern, I noticed that the largest size was a size 14. According to the body measurements for this pattern, I need a size 18. So that could be a bit of an issue. Quite often with patterns, I use a size down from what they say anyway, because I find that works better in terms of the level of ease I like to have in my clothes. So let's say it's 1 size smaller than I need it to be. But this is also designed for woven fabrics with no stretch to them. And while preparing to cut out of my various velvets, I discovered the black velvet is stretch velvet, can stretch along 2 axes. The green velvet is also stretch velvet that stretches along 1 axis. So the pattern is 2 sizes smaller than I need it to be for my body, according to the measurements. The fabrics that I wanted to use aren't the right kinds of fabrics, and if I use stretch fabrics for this instead of woven fabrics, as is recommended by the pattern, it could completely mess the entire thing up and be essentially unwearable. Another thing, to make this version of the dress with a central panel that is all one colour, as I was intending. So for this section that is white on here to be black and the black section to be green, I need to cut the entire front panel out of my black velvet. I do not have enough black velvet to do that. So I don't have enough of one of my fabrics, of the 2 fabrics that are both the wrong kind of fabric to use to cut out a pattern that is a size too small. The fabric being stretchy may offset the garment being a size too small. It also might not. But if I want to have a central black panel, at least at the top of this garment, I would need to fold my pattern piece for the front panel so that I can cut the top part of that panel out of the black and the bottom part of that panel out of green and piece them together. So were I to proceed with my too small pattern, with my stretch fabrics instead of my woven ones, with piecing the front panel instead of cutting it out of one fabric, there are a lot of risks, and a lot could go wrong. Am I going to let that stop me? Well, if you don't already know that the answer is, of course I will not let that stop me, I am going to forge ahead and hope for the best, then you must be new here. Hello, welcome to the channel, I'm Emily. Please stick around. I really am quite an irresponsible sewist, really. Oh well, so cutting out then. Let's do it. let's do that.
With it finally being time to actually start the project in earnest, I laid out my fabric, first pinning the upper back bodice piece and cutting that out, then tackling the giant half-circle pattern pieces for the back skirt, which I laid out as fully as possible on the fabric and cut a rough version of, ignoring any bits where the pattern exceeded the bounds of the fabric, and then I went back later to trim the skirt to an even length and shape. The next step was to figure out my front panel. I figured that around the waistline would be a good place for the black and green velvet to meet, especially as that would be covered by the back part of the dress that wraps around and closes at the front. This dress is not easy to explain well. Anyway, I thought close to the waistline would be the best place to join them. However, the pattern has darts that would go across where I wanted the two colours of velvet to meet, and I thought it would be neater and less bulky to cut and seam the upper and lower pieces together, then do my darts, than it would be to do darts in the top and bottom pieces individually and try to sew them together afterwards. So with all that in mind, I pinned and cut out the bottom of the front dress panel from my green velvet, and pinned the top section of the front dress panel to my black velvet, folded the part of the pattern I wasn't cutting out of the way, marked a seam allowance in chalk, which let me tell you was not easy because my chalk did not like this fabric and ended up covered in little black fuzzy bits, and finally cut that piece out, with a tiny bit of moral support from Puddle.
Apparently I don't have lipstick on my teeth. Ain't that nice? So we're back, and all our cutting out has been done. Actually, that's a lie. Not all our cutting out has been done. Only the cutting out for the dress has been done. But I'm bored of cutting out now, so it's time to do some sewing. Don't know if you can see by the tiny tail flicks, but as soon as I stop stroking Puddle, she gets grumpy. She's a needy bitch. Apparently, she wants to be either on me or beside me, being touched by me at all times. This is my life now. Could be a lot worse. Oh yeah, I said I was going to sew things. Right, let's do that. You're so sweet. Sewing.
I started with the centre back seam of the giant circle skirt and did the darts on the back bodice piece using this handy trick I learned recently where you use long thread ends to just guide your stitching. Following that, I pinned the two pieces I'd cut for the front panel together, and using a zigzag stitch so the fabric could still stretch around my body, I sewed that seam. And this is when I learned that it was nearly impossible to accurately stitch the green and black velvet together, at least with a zigzag stitch, because the height and bounciness, I guess, of the fuzz on the black velvet just meant they compacted, and the green velvet would shift so it was completely out of whack. It wasn't quite as bad if the green velvet was on the bottom against the feed dogs and the black velvet was on top against the presser foot, but it still was not great. So I just muddled through and did my best. After that seam was, I suppose, technically done, I trimmed as much fabric as I safely could off the seam allowance, laid the front piece out folded in half as accurately as I could, and I tried to lay the pattern piece on it correctly so I could pin it down and thread mark all the darts I needed for the front panel.
Okay, so I have a bit of a thing I need to figure out. I have thread marked all of my darts. Excellent. That's a great place to be. However, I've just realised that because I've made the top part of this black and the bottom part of it green, and there are darts that go across these pieces, I need to decide what colour of thread to use for the darts. Because if I use the green thread, it will potentially be visible on the black, and if I use the black thread, it will be visible on the green and potentially look like trash. However, something I hadn't considered is that because of how the front of the pattern ties, hold on, I'll find it, give me a second. I had a thought, which was that part of the back, the green section that is on the back of the dress, will be coming around to the front to close. The closure of the dress, if you will. So actually the location of these darts on the lower part of this won't be visible when the dress is closed, so maybe I should do them in black, because then on the top of the front, this bit, you won't have random green thread showing through, and the bottom part of it will be covered by the rest of the dress anyway. Okay, black thread. Black thread is what we're using.
So I re-threaded my sewing machine with black thread, added my darts to the front panel of the dress, and sewed the shoulder seams to connect the front and back dress.
So we're back, and the majority of the dress is constructed. Very exciting. The next step is to add binding around every possible edge of this thing. So I thought I would do something sensible and actually check how it was fitting me before I went through the rigmarole of adding binding to the whole thing. So I chucked it on and discovered some things. One is that when I was cutting out this dress, I added 3/4 of an inch to each side of the front and back of the dress. And it looks like, on the front at least, that was totally unnecessary. So I might cut that 3/4 of an inch off, or I might hem the front edge of the dress instead of binding it to save myself a bit of aggro. I'm not sure yet. The other thing I realised was the back bodice, was too long. Partly, I think, because of the weight of the skirt, it kind of pulls it down, and that seems to be a common complaint about this reproduction pattern, that it's not particularly well cut, and so the weight of the back skirt dragging the back of the dress downward and off the waist is an issue. However, the length of the front bodice is absolutely fine, so I think the path forward on that one is to unpick the shoulder seams, take an inch or so off each shoulder of the back bodice, and then just do the shoulder seams again, and continue as if nothing ever happened. I also need to make a bit of a decision about whether I'm actually going to put buttons on this, because the actual pattern suggests, demands, decrees that there shall be a centre back button where the front panel connects at the back, and 3 buttons at the centre front where the back panel connects. The idea of sewing buttonholes into stretch fabric fills me with like a mixture of disdain, disgust and fear. And I just don't want to do it. So what I'm considering instead is using the binding I have, which is actually pre-made binding that I bought for a project absolutely ages ago and never completed, surprise, surprise. So I could take small strips of this binding and use it to make ties for the front, 3 little ties at the waist at the front and 1 at the back, instead of buttons and buttonholes, which seems far less horrifying to me. So I think I'll make some decisions about how long I want those ties, cut some pieces of my binding to the right length, and then I will figure out, or attempt to figure out, how I'm actually going to attach them. Onward.
I figured out I could kill 2 birds with 1 stone by hemming the front edges of the giant skirt section, with the ends of my ties sandwiched in the fold of the hem. And then to make my ties secure, I would just need to add a little tack stitch through the tie and the very edge of the hem. I needed to adjust my shoulders before I could tackle the binding, so I unpicked the shoulder seams, trimmed the shoulders of the back bodice piece, and did my shoulder seams again. I then added the black binding to the entire neck edge, as well as around the armhole from the centre back to the centre front, leaving enough extra binding on both ends to make my final set of ties.
Right, so with the binding done on the neck edge and the armhole, the dress is essentially done. The only thing left to do is hem the bottom edge, and because it's a knit fabric, if I wanted to, I could leave the bottom edge completely unhemmed. And because I'm running out of time and have an entire bolero left to make, I think I'm going to plan for the hem of the dress to be the last thing I do, in case I don't have time, and then I can just not do it. I do plan things sometimes. The pattern that I'm going to be using for the bolero is one of the ones that I got in the job lot of patterns that I bought recently, and the pattern is Economy Design E65. I couldn't find much information, or any information actually, about that specific pattern, but based on the info that I could find about other pattern numbers close to it in number, it is actually from the 50s. So I spent some time the other day tracing that pattern and cutting out all of my pieces for the bolero, and now I just need to stick them all together. Oh, also worth saying, the bolero pattern is for a 36-inch bust. That is too small for me, and is meant to be made using woven fabrics, not stretch fabrics. So similarly to the dress, I don't know if it's going to turn out well, or even wearable. So, it'll be an adventure! Yay! Let's start that adventure. Maybe a montage. It feels like it's time for a montage. Yeah, let's do that. Yeah. So the bolero is coming together incredibly quickly. Astonishingly so, in fact. I'm really surprised. And come here then. Are you happy now? And all that's left to do now on the bolero is put the cuffs on the sleeves and the sleeves on the bolero, and then put its facings on. I'm trying to figure out how to do the cuffs and the sleeves, because the instructions for the pattern say to sew the folded cuff onto the sleeve and then use like tape to hide the raw edges on the inside of the sleeve. I can't really use any kind of tape because the fabric I'm using is stretchy. Also, the black velvet that I'm using for the cuffs is really thick, and I really don't want there to be like 4 layers of this around the bottom edge of the sleeve, because that'll be quite uncomfortable and look quite bulky, I think. So I have some options. One is that I could sew one end of the cuff to the sleeve and then fold over the cuff and finish the edges, but again, that kind of has the bulk issue still. Another is that I actually don't finish the edges at all, seeing as these are knit fabrics and won't fray. I just take the whole cuff, including the 2 raw edges of it, instead of sewing them to the right side of the fabric and then folding those seam allowances in, I sew it to the wrong side of the sleeve fabric, and then when I fold the cuff up into its correct position on the sleeve, then the seams and the raw edges will just be hidden between the cuff and the sleeve fabric, which might still be bulky, but I don't know if I can do anything about that. Unless I sew one side of the cuff to the inside of the fabric, the one that will be on the outside when it's flipped, kind of fold the other cuff edge in and like stitch it, almost like understitching and top stitching at the same time. Does that make sense? Would that be possible? I think that would be possible. I don't know if the description I just gave made any sense whatsoever, but I know what I mean. Because it won't be all that much less bulky, but there will be 1 fewer layer of fabric. Let's try it. What's the worst that can happen? Let's give it a go. Do an experiment.
So I pinned up one of the sleeves with its cuff in the way I had thought of, then realised it would double the number of seams I needed to do, and that if I wanted the cuff to be able to stretch, which I did, I wouldn't be able to top stitch it with a single line of straight stitch anyway. Therefore, I abandoned that idea entirely and just sewed both of the cuff edges to the wrong side of the sleeve fabric, so the seam allowance would be hidden behind the cuff when it folded up. Then I stitched on the facings and secured them down around the collar edge with some top stitching.
Okay, so I was doing some thinking about the collar of this, because usually this would be made from a woven material and you would stiffen the collar somehow, horsehair or fusible interfacing or whatever. Adding any kind of interfacing or stiffening to a stretch fabric is going to make it hang weird. So I was trying to figure out what my options were, and then I decided to just not stiffen it. Just not do it, just not add any form of interfacing. So I haven't stiffened it. I also haven't understitched the edge of the collar or anything, which means that it's currently very wibbly and not very stable. It doesn't really stay in that shape. But I'm planning on putting some ribbon along the edge of this, which will essentially mean I top stitch the entire edge of the collar anyway. Because of the various shapes and symbols in gold on Winifred Sanderson's original costume, I wanted to add something with that feel to this. So I went searching online and found some kind of cool jacquard ribbon. I'm not a huge fan of the white. I might do a little tester, because I have some green Sharpie, and I'm curious as to what the white will look like if I Sharpie over it in green. But I would have to do that very precisely and not hit any of the gold, which I'm not confident I can do. That's something for me to ponder, I suppose. You can come sit on my lap if you want. You can do it. I know you can. Come on, jumpy up. I'm gonna be lazy and make me pick you up. As I was saying, the bolero is nearly finished. I just need to tack down the facings and set in the sleeves. And I should do the sleeves first, obviously. But it's dinner time and I'm hungry, so I'm gonna go fix that. And depending on how I'm feeling after dinner, I might come and set in some sleeves, maybe. So yes, I'm gonna go eat a burrito. Come on, Puddle. It's dinner time.
A little longer than a few minutes later.
Alright, so we're back, and I have set my sleeves in Very exciting to have done that. Very happy it's over because, as everyone knows, sleeves are the devil. And after saying that I might do a Sharpie experiment, but it would probably be ridiculous for me to do that, I did indeed do a Sharpie experiment. Now I have 3 Sharpies that may be appropriate colours, and I've tested all 3 of them and then a combination. So this one is the lightest green, the darkest green, what I'm calling the bluest green, and then this one was me doing the bluest green and then trying to put the more yellow-toned lightest green over top. Interestingly, the lightest green Sharpie, I don't need to avoid the gold. It doesn't seem to mark it. The darkest green, I do need to be careful about hitting the gold, but I can wipe it off. And then this bluish green also seems to be light enough that it isn't particularly noticeable if I accidentally hit the gold. So that is very useful. And by the look of it, having tested them in a few different lights, shockingly, the teal colour seems to be the closest, at least under the main light in my sewing room, under my daylight lights, and under the light from my phone. It's too late in the day for me to check if that is actually true in real daylight, because there's none left. It's nighttime. And I like how the patterns on the ribbon look a lot better, and think they stand out a lot more when the white part is not white. So I think I'm going to spend a bunch of time figuring out what lengths of ribbon I need, and then colouring them in with Sharpie. What is my life? I do not know. I do not.
So, like an entirely reasonable adult human being, I spent the next 2 hours watching cartoons and colouring ribbon bluish green.
So my ribbon is now more colourful. My fingers are covered in Sharpie, and I've taken time to pin my ribbon to the bits of the bolero I want it sewn to, so now I just need to stitch it on, secure any of the bits of the facing that still need securing, and the bolero is finished. Let's get to it.
Because the location of the ribbon on the outside of the bolero and the edge of the collar overlapped, I thought it would be best to do the pretty tidy top stitching on the most visible parts of the ribbon and just fix down the loose edges that were on the inside of the bolero with some hand stitching later on.
Okay, I have a bit of a thing to figure out. The back facing of the bolero is very kind of relaxed and drapey and not staying in place, so I kind of tried to fix that a little bit by stitching the side seam of the facing to the side seam of the outer shell. It hasn't fixed it. One of my options, stitch it in place around the top edge of the facing as you normally would, but because this is stretchy fabric, I'm not quite sure how that would go, so I might just put a couple of tacking stitches in a few spots along the back. But the fact that it kind of drapes and falls quite easily means that the bottom edge of the back of the bolero looked really messy and really ugly. And I looked at this little part where the sleeve is, where there is zigzag stitching on the top of the velvet, and it isn't super visible. So I'm considering just zigzag stitching along the bottom edge, because I think it'll just make it look kind of neat and crisp in the way that the stitching on the back, where I've put the ribbon, looks neat. Other than that, this is really close to done. I'm going to put some teeny stitches where the corner bits of the ribbon are kind of poofing outward, and like put a little tack on the cuff and the sleeve so that that stays in place. But yeah, this is getting really close to done. I feel like I've said that the last like 4 times I've talked to the camera, but like, let me have my thing. It gives me hope. I'm gonna try zigzagging the bottom edge of this and see if it messes everything up. So it looks awful and has really dramatically stretched out the bottom edge. Not dramatically, it's just made it a little wibbly wobbly, which I'm not happy with, so I'm gonna unpick all of that and do what I should have done in the first place and understitch it. Understitching, just in case you don't know, don't think I have an edge that I can show you what understitching is. Basically, you sew your seam allowance to one side of the fabric as close to the seam as you can, and it means that the side that isn't stitched down kind of ooches over a bit more to make sure that the fabric that is meant to be at the top is the most visible, and the fabric underneath, like an undercollar or whatever, is hidden underneath it. You understitch the seam allowance to the undercollar so that the top bit like zhuzhes outward. That is a terrible description. I'll try and figure out a way of explaining it in some kind of reasonable manner. Why are you so insistent? Sorry, tiny paw just like appeared. Want to say hi? What are you sniffing me for? Sniff, sniff. I'm gonna go do some unpicking.
As very tired Emily was trying to explain, understitching is where you take a seam in an area that you want to lie or sit in a specific way, and with your joined pieces of fabric open, you stitch your seam allowance as close to your original line of stitching as you can, onto the fabric that you don't want to be seen. That anchors the connected pieces of fabric into a set position, so that the fabric that you do want to be seen is positioned slightly over the edge of the garment, and you're left with something that's nice and tidy, that only shows what you want on show, and most importantly, will stay in that aesthetically pleasing position. Now, we get to a bit of the project I only considered at the very last minute. Because while watching Hocus Pocus 2, I was reminded that Winifred wears black and green striped socks. And after scouring various options online and getting more and more anxious that whatever green striped socks I bought were going to clash horribly with the green of my dress, I did a completely normal person thing, and instead of buying stripy socks, I grabbed some black lace-top bobby socks, made tiny bows from the scraps of the now green and gold ribbon I had left over, tacked some narrow offcuts of my green velvet to the top edge of said lace-top bobby socks, and finally sewed my mini bows to the front, which is the least Winifred Sanderson last step to this project, but it was the final touch. And with that, my 1950s Hocus Pocus Halloween costume was complete.
So that's Winifred Sanderson done. I'm pretty happy with how it came out. There were some issues. The bolero is a little bit too small. It works well enough in the stretch fabric, but it definitely isn't ideal. I definitely had to keep pulling the fronts of it inward to get it to sit correctly on me. So if I was going to make that bolero again, even out of stretch fabric, I would definitely need to size it up. I'm pleased with how the dress looks, and I was really happy with the little ties at the waist instead of the buttons. I think that one worked really well and two looked really cute, but the dress itself is definitely a bit of a nightmare to wear, partly because with the way that it's built, with the front piece tying at the back and the back piece tying at the front, it doesn't actually have set armholes. And what I found while I was wearing it is that one, the back of the dress was definitely heavy enough to drag the front of the dress backward. So over time I just got very slightly strangled by the dress, but also that it can shift side to side as well, and if, like me, you have directions that you tend to move your body, or shapes you tend to pull it into, or directions you twist more than others, or hips you lean on more than others, then it just moves over time to a point where the armholes aren't even. So by the time I went to take it off, the armhole on my left side had grown considerably, and the armhole on my right side had shrunk enough that it was a little vice-like on my arm. Definitely not ideal. So if I were going to wear it again, then I would probably try to put some things in place to minimise the arm shifty issues. I don't know, like some snap poppers or something. I didn't expect, when I was making this, that the bolero would be the thing that I really liked and was more likely to wear again, so that's interesting. And I had a really great time doing my hair. I did a bunch of research into like 50s updos, and I was originally planning to go for a kind of Lucille Ball circa 1950s thing, but my hair is too long and that did not work. So instead I kind of went for like a 50s prom vibe. I had a lot of fun with this project. I also had a lot of fun filming myself lip syncing to various bits of the first Hocus Pocus.
Oh, look, another glorious morning. Makes me sick.
But yeah, I'm pleased with how it turned out. I had a fun time making it. I'm really happy that I got to use one of my vintage patterns, and I'm looking forward to cracking on with my next Halloween project, the video for which will come out on Halloween itself, should all go to plan. I hope you enjoyed this chaotic little sewing and costuming adventure. If you're new here and you want to stick around, that would be really cool, but whether you decide to keep hanging out or not, I hope everything is okay in your world. Happy Halloween, and I will see you all next time. Or I could pull a Winifred Sanderson and do my "Mary, take me to the window, I wish to say goodbye." I'll see you later. No. Yes. No. No. Hold on, I'll find it. Can't get it without shifting the camera. Please. Oh, please. Eee!
Dinner time. Dinner time. It's dinner time.
Huddle. No. No. Huddle. Stop. 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 Stop that. Get back to your spot.